The temperature inside the B-17 waist section had reached 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Harlan Treadwell could feel the skin on his palms blistering as he grabbed the ammunition box. The metal seared through the makeshift cloth wrapping on his hands. Inside the box, 400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition were cooking off, individual bullets firing in random directions, ricocheting off the aluminum walls of the fuselage. He carried the box to the open waist gun window and threw it out into the sky over France. 2,000 feet below, German soldiers watched it fall. The date was May 1st, 1943. The time was 2:14 in the afternoon. 3 men had already bailed out of the burning aircraft. Harlan Treadwell had a choice to make. The emergency exit door stood open. A parachute hung on the wall within arm's reach. Aviation gasoline was burning at temperatures that would melt human flesh on contact. Every reasonable calculation said to jump. Treadwell reached for another ammunition box instead. This is the story of the worst airman in the 306th Bomb Group. The man nobody wanted on their crew, the troublemaker who couldn't follow orders, the soldier who would be found washing dishes in a kitchen on the morning he was supposed to receive the Medal of Honor. Harlan Treadwell was heroic for 90 minutes on May 1st, 1943. He was problematic for the remaining 72 years of his life. The question that remains is simple. Is 90 minutes enough? 6 weeks earlier, Harlan Treadwell sat in a courtroom in Cairo, Michigan, listening to a judge offer him a choice he didn't want. The charge was failure to pay child support. Treadwell owed his ex-wife $237. He had 2 children he hadn't seen in 18 months. The money had gone to other things. Drinking mostly, some gambling. The usual ways a 31-year-old man wastes what little he has when he's decided his life doesn't matter. The judge was tired. He had seen 100 men like Treadwell, men who couldn't hold jobs, men who resented authority, men who were too smart for their own good and too stubborn to admit when they were wrong. 6 months in county jail, the judge said, or enlist in the armed forces. Your choice, Mr. Treadwell. Treadwell looked at his hands. Mechanic's hands, scarred and calloused from years of working on car engines in a garage that had gone out of business the previous fall. He had skills. He wasn't stupid. He just couldn't seem to make anything work the way it was supposed to. The uniform, he said. The judge signed the papers. Treadwell walked out of the courthouse a free man with a military obligation he had no intention of honoring with anything resembling enthusiasm. He was joining the Army Air Forces because the alternative was jail. Not because he loved his country, not because he wanted to fight fascism, not because he believed in the cause, because a judge in Michigan had given him no other option. That was January of 1943. By March, Harlan Treadwell was standing on the flight line at Thurley Airfield in England, watching B-17 Flying Fortresses take off into grey skies over Bedfordshire, and discovering that the military had even less patience for him than civilian employers had ever shown. Thurley was home to the 306th Bombardment Group. The men who flew from that grass airfield were the tip of the spear in America's strategic bombing campaign against occupied Europe. They flew into German airspace. They dropped bombs on factories and rail yards and submarine pens. They came back with holes in their aircraft and friends who didn't come back at all. The average B-17 crew in the spring of 1943 had a 50% chance of surviving their mandatory 25 mission tour. Some bomb groups were losing that many men in a single month. Harlan Treadwell arrived at Thurley with exactly 0 combat experience and a personality that made experienced combat airmen want nothing to do with him. The problems started immediately. He was 31 years old in an army of 20-year-olds. The pilots were younger than him. The officers giving him orders were a decade his junior. Treadwell had spent his entire adult life resenting people who told him what to do. The military was an entire system built on people telling other people what to do. The collision was inevitable. On his third day at Thurley, Treadwell slept through a mission briefing. The operations officer found him in his bunk at 0600, while the rest of the squadron sat in the briefing room learning about that day's target. The officer was a lieutenant, 24 years old, West Point educated, already stressed beyond his capacity by the daily mathematics of sending young men to probable death. "Sergeant Treadwell," the lieutenant said, "you were ordered to report to briefing at 0530. Treadwell opened his eyes, looked at the lieutenant, closed his eyes again. "Wasn't assigned to a crew yet," he said. "Didn't see the point." The lieutenant's jaw tightened. He wanted to scream. He wanted to grab this lazy, insubordinate mechanic from Michigan and throw him off the base. Instead, he wrote Treadwell up for failure to report as ordered and assigned him to kitchen police duty for the next 3 days. That was incident number 1. Incident number 2 came the following week. A waist gunner from the 423rd Squadron was explaining the proper way to clean a 50 caliber machine gun. Treadwell interrupted him to explain that the military's cleaning procedure was inefficient and that he had a better method based on his experience as a mechanic. The waist gunner was 20 years old. He had flown 8 combat missions. He had watched his best friend's head explode when a German cannon shell came through the fuselage at 25,000 feet. He did not need a 31-year-old man who had never been in combat lecturing him about machine gun maintenance. "Why don't you go clean something else, old man?" the gunner said. Treadwell bristled, called the kid arrogant, said something about young men who think they know everything just because they've been shot at a few times. The situation escalated. Words were exchanged. A sergeant had to separate them before it came to fists. Treadwell got another 3 days of KP duty and a formal written reprimand in his personnel file. The nickname came after that, Snuffy, like the character from the comic strips. The lazy hillbilly who was always scheming to get out of work, always had an excuse, always thought he was smarter than everyone else. The name fit too perfectly. Within 2 weeks, everyone at Thurley knew Harlan Treadwell as Snuffy, the man who couldn't be bothered to follow orders, the know-it-all who had an opinion about everything and the respect of no one. The third incident involved philosophy. Treadwell had read some Nietzsche before the war, some Schopenhauer. He had opinions about the nature of human existence and the futility of institutional authority. One evening in the mess hall, he decided to share these opinions with a table full of young airmen who were trying to eat their dinner in peace. He talked about the will to power. He talked about the death of God. He talked about how the military was a system designed to crush individual thought and turn men into interchangeable components. The airmen at the table listened for about 90 seconds. Then they picked up their trays and moved to another table. Treadwell sat alone, still talking, unaware or unconcerned that his audience had left. A bombardier watched this happen and shook his head. "That guy," he said to his navigator, "is going to get someone killed." By the end of March, Harlan Treadwell's reputation at Thurley was fully established. He was the worst airman in the 306th Bomb Group. Not because he lacked skills. Physically, he was exactly what the Air Forces needed for one very specific position. He was 5 feet 4 inches tall. Small frame, wiry build, perfect dimensions for the ball turret. The ball turret was a Sperry-rotating gun position that hung beneath the belly of the B-17, a plexiglass and steel sphere barely large enough for a man to curl into a fetal position. 2 50 caliber machine guns protruded from the front, a computing gun sight between them. The gunner sat with his knees pulled up to his chest, surrounded by machinery and ammunition separated from 30,000 feet of empty air by a few millimeters of aluminum and glass. It was the most claustrophobic position on the aircraft, the most vulnerable, the most psychologically demanding. Harlan Treadwell was the perfect size for it. In every other way, he was considered a liability. The men of the 423rd Bombardment Squadron developed a simple policy regarding Staff Sergeant Harlan Treadwell. Nobody wanted to fly with him. When a crew needed a replacement ball turret gunner, they asked for anyone else. Pilots specifically requested that he not be assigned to their aircraft. For 6 weeks, Treadwell sat on the ground while other men flew mission after mission over occupied Europe. He didn't complain. He seemed content to avoid combat. He pulled his KP duties. He showed up for required training. He went through the motions of being a soldier without ever committing to actually being one. The operations officers tried to find him a crew. The problem was that every pilot at Thurley had heard the stories. Snuffy Treadwell, the man who slept through briefings, the man who argued with everyone, the man who lectured kids about philosophy while they were trying to process the trauma of watching their friends die. Nobody wanted that man in their crew when the fighters came. On the morning of April 30th, 1943, the operations board went up in the briefing room. 78 B-17S were assigned to the next day's mission. Target the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France. The coastal city where German U-boats received maintenance and resupply before heading back into the Atlantic to sink Allied shipping. The airmen called Saint-Nazaire by another name, Flak City. The submarine pens were protected by more anti-aircraft guns per square mile than any other target in occupied France. The concrete structures housing the U-boats were so thick that even direct hits from 2,000-pound bombs often failed to penetrate. The Luftwaffe kept fighter squadrons nearby specifically to protect the facility. Bombing Saint-Nazaire meant flying into a concentration of defensive firepower that killed Americans with industrial efficiency. The crews knew this. They had known men who went to Saint-Nazaire and didn't come back. The mission was necessary. The U-boats were strangling the Atlantic supply lines. But necessary didn't mean survivable. In the 423rd Squadron Ready Room, Captain Everett Calloway looked at his crew roster and saw a problem. His ball turret gunner had come down with pneumonia the night before. The man was in the base hospital too sick to fly. Calloway needed a replacement. This was Calloway's 25th mission, his last mission. If he survived the next day's flight, he was going home, back to his wife in Ohio, back to a world where people didn't die in burning aircraft at 25,000 feet. 24 missions completed, one more to go, then safety, then life. He needed a competent ball turret gunner. He needed someone he could trust. The operations officer told him the only available replacement was Harlan Treadwell. Calloway had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. Snuffy Treadwell was a problem waiting to happen. But Calloway had also heard the alternative: fly with Treadwell or fly one man short. The ball turret position was critical. It covered the aircraft's vulnerable underside. Without a gunner there, the entire formation was exposed to attacks from below. Calloway made his decision. He would take Treadwell. He would keep him on a short leash. He would give explicit orders and make sure they were followed. 25 missions of experience had taught Calloway how to manage difficult people. He would manage Treadwell for one mission. Then he would go home. That decision would save his life. Harlan Treadwell found out about the assignment at 2200 hours on April 30th. An orderly came to his barracks and told him to report to Captain Calloway's crew for the next morning's mission. Treadwell's first combat mission. 6 weeks after arriving at Thurley. 6 weeks of being told he was worthless. 6 weeks of watching other men fly while he peeled potatoes and cleaned latrines. He should have been nervous. Most men were terrified before their first mission. The statistics were too clear, the odds too brutal. But Treadwell wasn't most men. He had a talent for not thinking about consequences. A lifetime of avoiding difficult truths had prepared him perfectly for ignoring the reality of what the next day would bring. He went to sleep without difficulty. Woke up at 0400 when the orderly came through the barracks, dressed in his flight suit, walked to the mess hall, ate powdered eggs and toast, listened to the briefing officer describe the target and the expected opposition. The briefing officer was honest. Saint-Nazaire would be heavily defended. Fighter opposition was expected to be intense. Flak concentrations over the target would be the heaviest they had encountered. Casualties were anticipated. The mission was necessary anyway. The U-boats had to be stopped. Treadwell sat in the back of the briefing room and absorbed none of this. He was thinking about the machine gun training he had received, the fixed targets he had practiced on, the procedures he had memorized. He was not thinking about what it would feel like when German fighters started shooting back. After the briefing, the crews gathered their equipment and walked to their aircraft. Treadwell followed Calloway's crew across the dewy grass of the Thurley flight line. The morning was cold. Grey clouds hung low over Bedfordshire. Somewhere above those clouds, the sun was rising. Down here, it was still dark. The B-17 sat waiting. Engines cold, propellers still. The ground crew had already loaded the bombs. 11,000 pounds of high explosive ordnance hanging in the bomb bay. Enough to kill hundreds of people if it fell on the right target. Enough to kill 10 men instantly if something went wrong during takeoff. Treadwell climbed aboard through the waste door. The interior of the B-17 smelled like oil and metal and the accumulated sweat of previous crews. He made his way forward past the radio compartment to the ball turret access hatch in the floor. The radio operator, Staff Sergeant Russell Dean, watched him crawl into position. Dean was a religious man. He carried a Bible in his flight suit pocket. Before every mission, he said a prayer for the crew. This morning he said an extra prayer for the new ball turret gunner, who had the eyes of a man who didn't understand what he was about to experience. The waist gunners were already at their positions. Staff Sergeant Warren Kincaid on the left side, Staff Sergeant Leonard Pruitt on the right. Both men were on their 15th mission. Both had seen enough combat to recognize incompetence when they saw it. Neither was happy about flying with Treadwell. "Try not to shoot us," Kincaid said as Treadwell passed. Treadwell ignored him, opened the ball turret hatch, climbed down into the sphere. The space was exactly as confined as he had been told. Barely enough room to move. The computing gun sight took up most of his forward view. The twin 50 caliber barrels protruded ahead of him. Below, through the plexiglass, he could see the grass of the airfield. This would be his world for the next 8 hours. Cramped, isolated, vulnerable. He had no idea what was coming. At 06:15, the engines started. One at a time, the Wright Cyclone radials coughing to life with roars that shook the entire airframe. Treadwell felt the vibration through every surface of the ball turret. The smell of exhaust drifted into the cramped space. At 06:30, the B-17S began taxiing. 78 heavy bombers moving in sequence toward the runway. The formation would assemble in the air, each group climbing to altitude, finding their positions, building the combat box that would give them mutual defensive fire support over the target. Treadwell watched the ground move beneath him. Grass, concrete, the edge of the runway. Then the acceleration of takeoff. The moment when the aircraft lifted and the ground fell away and there was nothing below him but air. His first time off the ground in a combat aircraft. His first time feeling the vulnerability of the ball turret position. The sensation of hanging beneath the fuselage with nothing between him and the earth except plexiglass and faith in the pilot's ability to keep the aircraft flying. The formation climbed through clouds, broke into sunlight at 12,000 feet, continued climbing to bombing altitude, 25,000 feet, where the air was thin and cold and the contrails from the engines drew white lines across the sky that German fighter controllers could see from 100 miles away. Treadwell's oxygen mask fed him air. The heater in the ball turret worked intermittently. His breath fogged the gun sight glass. He wiped it clear with a gloved hand and scanned the sky below for enemy fighters that hadn't appeared yet. The flight to the target took 3 hours. Treadwell spent that time alone with his thoughts in a sphere of plexiglass and steel. The other crew members could talk to each other on the intercom. They could move around the aircraft. They had space. Treadwell had the ball turret and nothing else. Over the target, the flak started. Black clouds of explosive fragments bursting at altitude. The formations flew through it because there was no choice. The bomb run required straight and level flight. Evasive maneuvers would scatter the bombs uselessly across the French countryside. Treadwell watched the flak bursts bloom beneath him, close enough to see the orange flash at the center of each explosion, close enough to hear the fragments pinging off the fuselage, not close enough to kill him. Not yet. The bombs dropped. The aircraft lurched upward as 11,000 pounds of weight disappeared from the bomb bay. The formation turned for home. The mission was complete. They had attacked the submarine pens. Whether they had hit anything useful wouldn't be known until the reconnaissance photos came back. For now, the only task was survival. The return flight would take them back across occupied France, over territory where German fighter squadrons waited for damaged bombers to fall out of formation, over coastal defences that would throw up walls of anti-aircraft fire at anything trying to reach the safety of the English Channel. In the cockpit, Captain Everett Calloway checked his fuel gauges and started calculating. They had enough to make it home. Barely. The headwinds had been worse than forecast. The formation had taken longer to assemble than planned. But the numbers worked. They would cross the coast with maybe 20 minutes of fuel remaining. Enough to find an airfield. Enough to land. Calloway had survived 24 missions by being careful, by running the numbers, by never taking unnecessary risks. This would be his 25th, his last. Then he was done. Then he went home. The navigator was supposed to guide them back, plot the course, make sure they crossed the French coast at the correct point, avoid the heaviest concentrations of German defences. At 1400 hours, the navigator made a mistake. He looked at the coastline below and saw what he expected to see instead of what was actually there. The Brittany Peninsula has a distinctive shape when viewed from 25,000 feet. So does the southern coast of England. In poor visibility with clouds obscuring landmarks, the two can look similar. The navigator mistook one for the other. He told Captain Calloway they were over the English Channel. Almost home, safe to descend. Calloway believed him. 24 missions of experience didn't protect against a navigator's error. He pushed the yoke forward and started down. The formation began descending through the cloud layer. Altitude dropping. 2,000 feet, 1,500, 1,000. They broke through the clouds at 2,000 feet. Directly below them was the city of Brest, France, one of the most heavily fortified German positions on the Atlantic coast, home to submarine pens, naval facilities, and enough anti-aircraft guns to turn the sky into shrapnel. The formation had descended into a killing zone. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire immediately. The Germans didn't need to aim carefully. The American bombers were at 2,000 feet, point-blank range for heavy flak guns. The shells burst in clusters, black smoke and orange fire and fragments of steel moving at supersonic velocity. The B-17S scattered, pilots throwing their aircraft into evasive maneuvers, trying to climb back into the safety of altitude, trying to get away from the wall of metal filling the air around them. Captain Calloway hauled back on the yoke. The engine screamed, the aircraft climbed, but not fast enough. Harlan Treadwell, suspended in the ball turret, watched the city appear below him. He didn't know it was Brest. He didn't know they had made a mistake. He only knew that suddenly there were explosions everywhere and the aircraft was shaking and something had gone very wrong. Then the fighters came. Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, 15 to 20 of them, German pilots who had been waiting for exactly this kind of mistake. American bombers at low altitude, separated from their formation, vulnerable. The fighters dove from above, cannon shells and machine gun fire ripping through the aluminum skin of the B-17S. The defensive gunners fired back, the sky filled with tracers, red lines going up from the bombers, white lines coming down from the fighters. Treadwell squeezed the triggers of his twin 50s. The guns roared. Empty brass casings ejected and fell away into the sky. He had no idea if he was hitting anything. The fighters were moving too fast, closing at 300 miles per hour, there and gone in seconds. One of the fighters focused on Callaway's aircraft. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, a veteran pilot with 11 confirmed kills. Weber saw the B-17 climbing desperately, saw the ball turret gunner firing wild bursts, saw an opportunity. He rolled his FW190 into a dive, lined up the shot. The computing gun sight in his cockpit tracked the bomber's path. He squeezed the trigger. Two 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns fired in unison. The shells walked across the B-17's left wing, punched through aluminum, found the fuel tank. Aviation gasoline began streaming from the ruptured tank. A mist of highly volatile liquid spraying into the slipstream. Some of it flowed into the radio compartment through the holes the cannon shells had torn in the fuselage. In the radio compartment, Russell Dean saw the fuel spraying, smelled it, knew immediately what was about to happen. Fuel and air and any source of ignition. The oxygen system ran through this compartment. The electrical wiring. A single spark would be enough. The spark came from the damaged electrical system. The fuel ignited. The radio compartment filled with fire. Flames climbed the walls, raced along the fuel-soaked surfaces. The temperature jumped from 40 below zero to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in seconds. Dean grabbed his parachute. There was no time for anything else, no time to fight the fire, no time to warn the rest of the crew. He clipped the parachute to his harness and went out the waist door without hesitation. The smart choice, the right choice, the choice that would get him killed before sunset. In the waist section, Warren Kincaid and Leonard Pruitt saw the flames, saw Dean jump, made the same calculation. The aircraft was on fire at 2,000 feet. They had maybe 90 seconds before structural failure. Parachutes worked, burning aircraft didn't. Kincaid bailed out at 14:09. Pruitt followed at 14:10. 3 men gone in 60 seconds. 3 parachutes opening in the sky over Brest, German soldiers watching them descend, preparing to capture them. In the ball turret, Harlan Treadwell felt the aircraft shudder, felt the change in engine sound, smelled smoke. He cranked the manual traverse handle and rotated the turret to look up into the fuselage. Through the access hatch, he could see fire. Orange flames visible in the waist section. Smoke pouring through the narrow spaces of the interior. He cranked the turret into position and climbed up through the hatch. The heat hit him immediately. The waist section was an oven. The fire had spread from the radio compartment. Aviation fuel was burning on every surface. The temperature was rising toward levels that would melt human flesh. The emergency exit door stood open. Kincaid and Pruitt were gone. Their parachutes hung empty on the wall. Treadwell could see sky through the open door. 2,000 feet of air between him and the occupied territory below. Every instinct said jump. Every calculation of survival probability said get out. The aircraft was burning. The fire was spreading. The Germans were still shooting. There was no reason to stay. Treadwell looked forward toward the cockpit. Captain Callaway was still flying, still fighting the controls, still trying to get the aircraft home. Treadwell looked aft toward the tail section. Through the smoke, he could see movement. Someone was still back there, trapped, unable to move forward through the flames. Sergeant Clayton Voss, the tail gunner, wounded during the fighter attack, shrapnel in his legs, unable to walk, unable to crawl through the burning waste section to the exit door. If Treadwell jumped, Voss would burn alive. If Treadwell stayed, they would probably both die anyway. But nobody would know Treadwell had abandoned him. Nobody would see him bail out. He could jump and claim later that he never saw Voss, that the smoke was too thick, that there was nothing he could do. Harlan Treadwell was not a good man. He was not brave. He was not selfless. He was a 31-year-old screw-up from Michigan who had joined the military to avoid jail, a man who couldn't follow orders, a man nobody wanted on their crew. But he looked at that open door and he thought about one thing. If he jumped, he would have to live the rest of his life knowing he left Clayton Voss to burn. And Harlan Treadwell had enough self-hatred already. He didn't need to add that. He grabbed a blanket from the storage locker and started moving toward the fire. The time was 14:14. May 1st, 1943. 90 minutes of hell were about to begin. The blanket caught fire in Harlan Treadwell's hands before he'd beaten back even 2 feet of flames. He threw it away, watched it curl and blacken in the corner of the waste section, grabbed a piece of canvas from the equipment locker. Same result. The aviation fuel burned too hot, too fast, spreading across too wide an area for any conventional firefighting method to work. The temperature in the waste section had exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The aluminum skin of the fuselage was conducting heat like a griddle. Treadwell's flight suit was soaked with sweat within 30 seconds. The moisture evaporated instantly in the superheated air. His skin felt like it was shrinking. Through the intercom, he could hear Captain Calloway's voice, calm, controlled. The voice of a man who had survived 24 missions by staying focused when everything around him was falling apart. Fire in the waste section. 3 crew members bailed out. Anyone still aboard, report status. Treadwell keyed his throat mic. His voice came out hoarse from smoke inhalation. Ball turret gunner still here, Captain. Tail gunner is wounded, can't move. I'm fighting the fire. A pause. Then Calloway's voice again. Different now. Surprised. Treadwell, you stayed? Yes, sir. You stayed. Another pause. Longer this time. Can you control it? Treadwell looked at the flames climbing the walls, at the fuel-soaked surfaces still igniting, at the smoke filling every cubic inch of available space. Working on it, sir. He wasn't controlling anything. The fire was winning. But admitting that would serve no purpose. Calloway had enough problems. He was flying a damaged aircraft with a ruptured fuel tank and German fighters still in the area. He didn't need to know that his ball turret gunner was about to be cooked alive in the waste section. The ammunition became the next crisis. .50 caliber ammunition was stored in metal boxes along both sides of the waste section. Thousands of rounds. Each box held 400 rounds in linked belts. The brass casings were designed to withstand significant heat during normal firing. But normal firing didn't involve being immersed in burning aviation fuel for extended periods. The temperature inside the first box reached the point where the powder charges began to cook off. The sound was distinctive. A sharp crack. Then another. Then a rapid series as the heat spread through the box. The bullets weren't firing from guns. They were exploding inside the container. The brass casings fragmented. The bullets separated from the casings and ricocheted in random directions inside the box. Then the box itself failed. The metal warped from the heat. The lid blew off. 400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition began firing in every direction at once. Treadwell hit the deck, covered his head with his arms. Bullets pinged off the aluminum walls, punched new holes in the fuselage. One round passed 6 inches above his back. Another hit the radio equipment and exploded in a shower of sparks. The box emptied itself in 15 seconds. Then silence. Smoke. The continuing roar of the main fire. Treadwell looked up, counted the remaining ammunition boxes. 11 more, each one a bomb waiting to detonate. Each one adding more chaos to a situation that was already beyond any reasonable hope of control. He made a decision that violated every safety protocol the Army Air Forces had ever written. He crawled to the nearest ammunition box. The metal was hot, not yet critical, but getting there. He grabbed the carrying handles with his bare hands. The skin on his palms blistered instantly. The pain was extraordinary, like grabbing a pot that had been sitting on a stove for an hour. The nerve endings in his hands screamed. His brain told him to let go. He didn't let go. He carried the box to the waist gun window. The slipstream tore at his flight suit. 2,000 feet below the coast of France spread out like a map. He lifted the box, threw it out the window, watched it tumble away into the sky. 1 down, 11 to go. The second box was hotter, the pain worse. Treadwell's hands were already damaged. The blisters were popping. Clear fluid running down his wrists. When he grabbed the second box, he felt skin tearing. Actual layers of epidermis separating from the flesh beneath. He carried it to the window anyway, threw it out, turned back for the third. By the fifth box, his hands were bleeding. The skin on his palms had been burned away completely in some places, raw flesh exposed to the superheated air. Every time he grabbed another box, he could feel the metal searing deeper, burning through layers he didn't know he had. He kept working. Between ammunition runs, he fought the fire. He had discovered that the relief tube offered a small amount of liquid. The crew urinated into a funnel connected to a tube that vented outside the aircraft. Treadwell disconnected the tube, used the contents to douse small sections of flame. When that ran out, he found a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. The extinguisher was designed for electrical fires. It was nearly useless against burning aviation fuel. But nearly useless was better than completely useless. He emptied it on the largest concentration of flames, bought himself 30 seconds of reduced fire intensity. When the extinguisher ran dry, he urinated directly on the burning surfaces. The absurdity of the action didn't register. Nothing mattered except suppressing the flames. If his own bodily fluids could reduce the fire by even 1 degree, he would use them. The Focke-Wulf fighters had not finished. Hauptmann Klaus Weber circled back for another attack run. He had seen the smoke trailing from the crippled B-17, had watched 3 parachutes deploy. The bomber should have gone down by now, should have lost structural integrity, should have fallen out of the sky in pieces. Instead, it kept flying, kept climbing, kept heading west toward the English Channel. Weber checked his fuel gauge. He had perhaps 10 minutes of combat time remaining before he would need to turn back. The British coast was ahead. He didn't venture over water where RAF Spitfires patrolled, but he had 10 minutes, enough for 3 more attack runs, enough to finish what he had started. He rolled his FW190 into position, dove from 4 o'clock high. The computing gun sight tracked the bomber. He squeezed the trigger. Cannon shells walked across the B-17's fuselage, punched through aluminum, created new holes in an aircraft already perforated by previous attacks. In the waist section, Treadwell heard the impacts, felt the aircraft shudder. A cannon shell hit 18 inches from his position, exploded against the frame. Shrapnel peppered the interior surfaces. He abandoned firefighting. Swung the left waist gun toward the diving fighter. His hands screamed in protest as he grabbed the handles. The burned flesh couldn't grip properly. His fingers slipped. He adjusted, gripped harder, ignored the sensation of raw meat grinding against metal. The gun roared. 50 caliber rounds streaked toward the FW190. Treadwell had no formal training in deflection shooting. He had practiced on stationary targets, had memorized the procedures. but procedures didn't prepare you for a fighter closing at 300 miles per hour. He filled the air with lead and hoped something would connect. Weber's fighter flashed past. Treadwell couldn't tell if he'd scored any hits. Didn't matter. The fighter was gone, for now. He turned back to the fire. The cycle continued. Fight, fire. Man guns when fighters attacked. Back to fire. Back to guns. Again and again. Each cycle bleeding away seconds of his life. Each decision choosing between two impossible tasks. The 8th ammunition box was actively cooking off when he grabbed it. He could feel the rounds exploding inside the container, feel the metal flexing from the pressure. He carried it anyway, lifted it to the window. A bullet discharged inside the box just as he released it. The recoil jerked the container. It clipped the edge of the window frame. Tumbled away, trailing smoke. 3 boxes remaining. Treadwell's hands had gone beyond pain into something else, a numbness punctuated by spikes of agony when he moved his fingers. The blood made everything slippery. He had to squeeze harder to maintain grip. Squeezing harder meant more pressure on the burned tissue, more damage. He threw out the 9th box, the 10th, the 11th. The last ammunition box was the hottest. Treadwell could see the metal glowing dull red in places. He wrapped his hands in shredded pieces of his flight suit. The fabric provided minimal insulation. He grabbed the handles, lifted. The weight shifted. His grip slipped. The box dropped, hit the deck, bounced. Inside the box, a round cooked off, then another. The lid began to warp. Treadwell grabbed the box again, used both arms to cradle it against his chest. The heat burned through his flight suit, through the layers of clothing beneath. He could smell his own skin cooking. Ran to the window. Threw the box out with everything he had left. It tumbled away, exploded in mid-air 30 feet from the aircraft. A bright flash, fragments spinning off in all directions. One piece hit the horizontal stabilizer, left a dent but no critical damage. The ammunition was gone, all of it, thrown out of a moving aircraft by a man whose hands looked like ground meat. Treadwell allowed himself 5 seconds of rest, leaned against the fuselage wall. The metal was hot but no longer unbearable. The fire was consuming itself, running out of fuel to burn, still dangerous, still spreading, but losing intensity. 5 seconds, then back to work. He crawled aft toward the tail section, toward Clayton Voss. The smoke was thicker here. The flames had spread along the crawlway. Treadwell pulled his flight suit collar up over his nose and mouth. It helped marginally. He could still feel the toxic fumes burning his lungs with each breath. He found Voss conscious but fading. The tail gunner had taken shrapnel during the initial fighter attack. Fragments had torn through his legs and lower torso. He had been bleeding for 45 minutes, losing blood volume, going into shock from the combination of blood loss and pain and terror. Voss looked at Treadwell through the smoke. His voice was weak. "You should have jumped." Treadwell opened the aircraft's emergency medical kit, found bandages, sulfur powder, morphine syrettes. His hands were too damaged to perform delicate work. He tore the bandage packages open with his teeth, dumped sulfur powder on the worst of Voss's wounds, wrapped the bandages as tightly as he could manage with hands that had lost most of their fine motor control. "Probably," Treadwell said, "but I'm too stupid to know when to quit." He found Voss's oxygen hose, severed by shrapnel. The tail gunner had been breathing smoke for 45 minutes. His lungs were damaged, his oxygen saturation critically low. Treadwell had an emergency oxygen bottle clipped to his flight suit, a small reserve bottle, maybe 10 minutes of supply. He unclipped it, handed it to Voss. "Take this. Breathe slow." Voss took the bottle, put the mask to his face, breathed. The oxygen helped immediately. Color returned to his face. His eyes focused. "What about you?" Voss asked. "I'll manage." It was a lie. Without supplementary oxygen at 2,000 feet, Treadwell would be fine. But if Calloway had to climb to avoid fighters, the thinner air at higher altitude would incapacitate him quickly. He was giving Voss his only backup oxygen supply, condemning himself to hypoxia if the circumstances changed. The choice was easy. Voss was wounded. Voss needed it more. Mathematics of survival. Treadwell finished the bandaging, made Voss as comfortable as possible in the cramped tail compartment, promised he would get him home, then crawled back toward the waist section. The fire had spread during his absence. The flames had found new fuel sources, the insulation around the electrical wiring, the fabric seat cushions. Everything that could burn was burning. Treadwell looked at the spreading flames and felt something close to despair. He had thrown out the ammunition, had saved Voss, had done everything a human being could reasonably be expected to do, and the fire was still winning. Then he noticed something. The waist gun windows were open, had been open since the beginning of the fire. The slipstream created airflow through the fuselage, fresh air feeding the flames, oxygen keeping the combustion going. What if he closed the windows? The thought was almost too simple, too obvious. If he could isolate sections of the fire, cut off the oxygen supply, the flames would suffocate themselves. He moved to the right waist gun window. The opening was large, maybe 3 feet across. No glass, just an opening in the fuselage where the gun could traverse freely. He pulled the gun inside, latched it in the stored position. There was a metal cover designed to close over the window during non-combat flight. Treadwell had never used it, had never seen it used. He found the cover stowed beneath the gun position, pulled it out, fitted it into place over the window opening. The airflow changed immediately. The roar of the slipstream diminished. The fire in that section of the fuselage flickered, began to die. It was working. Treadwell moved to the left window, repeated the process, pulled the gun inside, found the cover, fitted it into place. The fire died further. He worked systematically through the waist section, closing off air sources, smothering the flames section by section. The fire fought back, found new places to burn, but it was losing the battle now. Without fresh oxygen, the combustion couldn't sustain itself. At 15:35, 71 minutes after the fire started, Treadwell extinguished the last visible flame. Smoke remained. Smouldering hot spots that could reignite, charred surfaces throughout the waist section, but active fire was dead. He had won. The cost was written on his hands, on his lungs, on every surface of exposed skin. His palms were destroyed. Second and third degree burns covering both hands completely. The flesh was black in some places, red and weeping in others. White bone visible where the deepest burns had penetrated. His lungs felt like he had inhaled ground glass. Each breath brought fresh pain. The smoke damage was permanent, scarring that would last the rest of his life. Reduced lung capacity, chronic breathing problems. His flight suit was covered in blood and soot and fluids he couldn't identify. The smell of burned rubber and aviation fuel had saturated every fiber. He would never get the smell out. Years later, certain odors would trigger immediate flashbacks to this moment. But he had won. The intercom crackled. Captain Calloway's voice, still calm, still controlled, but with an undertone of something that might have been hope. "Treadwell, status report." Treadwell keyed his throat mic. His voice was barely recognizable, hoarse from smoke, weak from exhaustion. "Fire's out, Captain. Tail gunner is wounded but stable. Waist section is destroyed but structurally intact." Silence on the other end. Treadwell could imagine Calloway in the cockpit, processing this information, recalculating survival probabilities, adjusting his assessment of the man he had considered a liability 6 hours earlier. "You fought that fire alone for 70 minutes. "Yes, sir." "The ammunition?" "Threw it out the windows, sir." "Your hands?" "Not good, sir, but functional." Another pause. When Calloway spoke again, his voice carried something that sounded like awe. "Stand by, Treadwell. We're crossing the coast in 5 minutes. I'm getting us home." Through the damaged fuselage, Treadwell could see ocean. The English Channel spreading below like hammered metal. Grey water, white caps. No land visible yet, but close. They were close. The fuel gauges in the cockpit showed nearly empty. The ruptured tank had dumped most of their reserve over France. What remained would barely get them to the English coast. Landing at Thurley was impossible. They needed to find any flat surface, any airfield, anything long enough to put down a B-17. Calloway spotted the coast of Cornwall through the haze, scanned for options, found one. Pre-Danach RAF station, a grass airfield on the southwestern tip of England, built for fighters. Short runway, minimal facilities. But it was flat, and it was close, and it was their only choice. He lined up the approach, dropped the landing gear. 3 green lights confirmed wheels down and locked. The aircraft descended, passed over the threshold. The grass runway appeared beneath them. The touchdown was smooth. Calloway had landed damaged bombers before. He knew how to handle aircraft that wanted to do anything except fly straight. The wheels touched grass. The B-17 rolled, speed bleeding off, the end of the runway approaching but manageable. Then the fuselage cracked. The fire had done more damage than anyone realized. The aluminum skin around the radio compartment had lost structural integrity. The metal had been heated beyond its stress limits, cooled unevenly, developed microscopic fractures that spread and joined and weakened the entire section. The stress of landing, the weight of the aircraft settling onto its wheels, the forces compressing the fuselage. It was more than the weakened structure could bear. The B-17 broke in half just behind the wing root. The nose section continued forward. The tail section ground to a halt separately. Metal screamed. Rivets popped. The aircraft that had held together through fire and fighters and 70 minutes of hell finally surrendered to physics. Rescue crews sprinted from the edge of the runway. They expected bodies, expected to find dead men in a shattered aircraft, expected the worst because that's what burning bombers usually delivered. What they found instead was Harlan Treadwell climbing out of the wreckage. Hands wrapped in bloody bandages, flight suit destroyed, face black with soot, helping a wounded tail gunner to safety. The ground crew stood and stared. They had seen damaged aircraft before. They had seen bullet holes and flak damage and engines blown off wings, but they had never seen anything like this. They counted the holes later. 3,500 individual penetrations, bullets, cannon shells, shrapnel fragments. The fuselage looked like a sieve. The fact that it had remained airborne defied every principle of aeronautical engineering. The fact that anyone had survived the fire defied belief entirely. Captain Everett Calloway wrote his mission report that evening. His hand shook as he held the pen. Not from fear. That came later. From the realization of how close he had come to dying. How close his entire crew had come to being names on a memorial wall. He described the navigation error, the attack over Brest, the fire, the 3 men who bailed out. Then he reached the part about Treadwell. He stopped writing, stared at the blank page, tried to find words adequate to describe what he had witnessed. Finally, he wrote simply, "Staff Sergeant Harlan Treadwell's actions were solely responsible for the safe return of this aircraft and the survival of all crew members aboard. He fought fire for 90 minutes with burned hands and no assistance. He threw burning ammunition from the aircraft while under fighter attack. He saved the tail gunner's life by sharing his oxygen supply. I recommend him for the Medal of Honor without reservation. 6 weeks ago, I did not want this man on my crew. Tonight, I owe him my life." The report went to the 306th Bomb Group commander. then to 8th Air Force Headquarters, then to the Pentagon. Each level of command read it and reached the same conclusion. This was Medal of Honor material. This was exactly the kind of story the War Department needed. A hero, an underdog, an impossible situation overcome through courage and determination. The machinery of recognition began to turn. But before any of that could happen, someone needed to tell Harlan Treadwell what had become of the 3 men who had jumped. The intelligence report arrived on May 2nd, decoded messages from French resistance networks, information about American airmen who had parachuted into occupied territory, Staff Sergeant Russell Dean, radio operator, captured by German forces at 14:20 on May 1st, shot while attempting to escape custody, died at 18:30, body left on the roadside as a warning to other potential escapees. Staff Sergeant Warren Kincaid, waist gunner, captured at 14:25, died during interrogation at 2015. Cause of death listed as injuries sustained during questioning. The Gestapo wanted information about bombing targets and radar capabilities. Kincaid died before providing anything useful. Staff Sergeant Leonard Pruitt, waist gunner, captured at 14:30, executed at 2100 as a terror flyer under orders from local German command, shot in the back of the head, buried in an unmarked grave outside Brest. None of the 3 men who made the smart choice survived the day. All 6 men who stayed aboard the burning aircraft made it home. The mathematics of survival had produced a result that defied every reasonable calculation. The men who jumped died. The men who stayed lived. Chaos and chance and the actions of one problematic ball turret gunner had rewritten what should have been inevitable. Harlan Treadwell was in the base hospital when they told him. His hands were wrapped in fresh bandages. Skin grafts scheduled for the following week. Morphine dulling the worst of the pain, but leaving him coherent enough to understand. The medical officer read him the intelligence report, explained what had happened to Dean and Kincaid and Pruitt, watched Treadwell's face for reaction. Treadwell said nothing for a long time. Then, they made the right choice, the smart choice. They should have lived. But they didn't, the medical officer said. You stayed. You lived. You saved 5 other men. That's what matters. Treadwell looked at his bandaged hands, thought about 70 minutes of fire, thought about 3 men falling through French sky toward capture and death. I didn't stay because I was brave, he said quietly. I stayed because I was afraid of being called a coward. That's not heroism. That's just vanity. The medical officer had no response to that. He left Treadwell alone with his morphine and his guilt, and the knowledge that accidental heroism was still heroism, regardless of motivation. Outside, the spring rain fell on Thurley Airfield. B-17S prepared for the next day's mission. The war continued. Men died. Others survived. The machinery ground forward. And somewhere in the administrative offices a Medal of Honor recommendation was working its way through channels about to transform a problematic airman into a national symbol. Whether Harlan Treadwell was ready for that transformation was irrelevant. The decision had already been made. The article appeared in Stars and Stripes on May 10th, 1943. Graham Pierce was 23 years old, a journalist assigned to cover the 8th Air Force bombing campaign from England. He had been looking for human interest stories, something to boost morale on the home front, something to prove that American boys were winning the war through courage and determination. Captain Calloway's mission report had landed on Pierce's desk through the Military Public Affairs Office. The story was too perfect to ignore. The worst airman in the squadron becomes a hero. The man nobody wanted saves 6 lives. 90 minutes of impossible firefighting by a ball turret gunner with burned hands. Pierce arrived at Thurley on May 8th. Found Treadwell in the base hospital, hands still bandaged, lungs still damaged, but conscious, coherent, willing to talk. The interview lasted 2 hours. Pierce took notes, asked questions, let Treadwell tell the story in his own words. The journalist had interviewed dozens of combat airmen. He recognized something in Treadwell's voice, a distance, like the man was describing events that had happened to someone else. "Why did you stay?" Pierce asked. 3 men jumped. You could have followed them. No one would have blamed you. Treadwell looked at his bandaged hands. "I didn't think about it," he said. "I saw Clayton in the tail section, saw he was wounded. If I jumped, nobody would know I left him there. It seemed worse than staying. You fought the fire for 90 minutes. I fought the fire because it was there, because stopping meant dying. You don't think about heroism when your hands are burning. You just keep moving." Pierce wrote it all down. The blankets that caught fire, the ammunition boxes thrown from the aircraft, the relief tube and the fire extinguisher, and the desperate improvisation, the simple innovation of closing the windows to smother the flames. He wrote about the 3 men who jumped and died, about the randomness of survival, about how the coward's choice turned out to be fatal and the hero's choice turned out to be survival. The article ran with a headline that would follow Treadwell for the rest of his life. "The man nobody wanted becomes a hero." Within a week, the story had been picked up by newspapers across the United States. The Associated Press ran it. Local papers in Michigan printed it with pride. Here was a boy from Cairo who had done something extraordinary, a working-class mechanic who had saved lives through courage and quick thinking. The letters started arriving at Thurley within days, thousands of them, addressed to Staff Sergeant Harlan Treadwell, marriage proposals from women he had never met, autograph requests from children, congratulations from First World War veterans who recognized the particular kind of hell that aerial combat delivered. The postal clerks at Thurley had never processed this much correspondence for a single enlisted man. They stacked the letters in boxes, delivered them to the hospital ward where Treadwell was recovering from his skin grafts. Treadwell read some of them, stopped reading after the first 100. They all said the same thing: "You're a hero, you're an inspiration. You make us proud to be American." He didn't feel like any of those things. He felt like a man who had made a series of desperate choices because the alternative was worse. The distance between what people thought he was and what he knew himself to be grew wider with every letter. The fame went to his head anyway, not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, in small increments, the way poison accumulates in the bloodstream. People at Thurley started treating him differently. Officers who had written him up for disciplinary infractions now wanted to shake his hand. Airmen who had avoided him in the mess hall now asked him to tell the story of May 1st. The attention was intoxicating. For the first time in his life, people wanted to hear what Harlan Treadwell had to say. He started signing autographs. Nothing wrong with that. Plenty of servicemen signed autographs for civilians who asked. But Treadwell added something, a suffix after his name. Harlan Treadwell, CMH, Congressional Medal of Honor. The decoration he had been recommended for, but had not yet received. The award that required approval from multiple levels of command and the Secretary of War himself. He was signing his name with honors he hadn't earned yet. It was a small thing, a vanity. But it revealed something about how the attention was changing him. The story itself began to change too. Small details at first, emphasis shifting. When Treadwell told the story to visiting journalists, he remembered things that hadn't appeared in the original account. The fire was a little hotter, the fighter attacks a little more intense, his own role a little more central. Nothing dramatic, nothing obviously false, just the natural tendency of human memory to enhance events in the retelling, to make ourselves a bit more heroic in our own narratives. Other crew members noticed. Captain Calloway heard Treadwell describe fighting off 20 German fighters single-handedly. The actual number had been closer to 6 or 7 aircraft making multiple passes. Calloway said nothing. Treadwell had saved his life. If the man wanted to embellish a little who was Calloway to contradict him, the Medal of Honor recommendation moved through official channels. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, reviewed the paperwork personally. Read Calloway's report. Read the witness statements. Examined the photographs of the damaged aircraft with its 3,500 holes. The evidence was overwhelming. Staff Sergeant Treadwell had performed acts of valor that far exceeded any reasonable expectation. The recommendation was approved, forwarded to Washington. The War Department reviewed the case and concurred. The medal was authorized. A ceremony would be scheduled. The first enlisted airman to receive the Medal of Honor in the European theater. It would be a major event. The kind of publicity the War Department needed to maintain support for the bombing campaign. Secretary of War Robert Woodring would travel to England personally to present the decoration. The date was set for July 15th, the largest public ceremony the 8th Air Force had ever conducted. Photographers were notified, newsreel cameras arranged. A formation of B-17S would fly overhead during the presentation. Every detail coordinated to generate maximum positive coverage for the war effort. In the rush of planning a major military ceremony, someone forgot to tell Harlan Treadwell when it was happening. The public relations officers assumed the squadron had notified him. The squadron officers assumed public relations had handled it. In the bureaucratic confusion of organizing an event involving the Secretary of War and 500 assembled personnel, the guest of honor fell through the cracks. July 15th arrived. Secretary Woodring stood at the podium. The B-17S circled overhead, burning fuel the 8th Air Force could not afford to waste. The assembled airmen stood in formation in the summer heat. The newsreel cameras rolled. Staff Sergeant Harlan Treadwell was nowhere to be found. The operations officer sent search parties across Thurley. They checked the barracks. Empty. They checked the officers' club. Empty. They checked every building where an airman might reasonably spend a Thursday morning. Nothing. Finally, someone thought to check the mess hall. They found Treadwell in the kitchen. He was not eating breakfast. He was scraping dried food from metal trays into garbage bins, washing dishes, performing kitchen police duty as punishment for his latest disciplinary infraction. The night before July 14th, Treadwell had gotten into an argument with a mess sergeant about food quality. The discussion had escalated. Voices were raised. The mess sergeant was a lifer, a man who took military protocol seriously. He didn't care if Treadwell was receiving the Medal of Honor tomorrow. Insubordination was insubordination. KP duty. Report to the kitchen at 0500. That was the punishment. Treadwell had reported. Had been working for 3 hours. Wasn't thinking about the ceremony because nobody had specifically told him it was happening today. The officer who found him stood in the kitchen doorway and tried to process what he was seeing. The man about to receive the nation's highest military decoration, elbow deep in dishwater, grease stains on his uniform. The Secretary of War waiting on a platform 500 yards away. "Sergeant Treadwell," the officer said carefully. "The ceremony started 10 minutes ago." Treadwell looked up from the dishes, blinked. "What ceremony, sir?" "Your Medal of Honor ceremony. Secretary Woodring is here. Everyone is waiting." The moment stretched. Treadwell looked down at his soaking wet hands, at the grease-stained uniform, at the pile of unwashed trays still waiting. He had 3 more hours of KP duty assigned. "I'm supposed to finish this, sir. Mess sergeant's orders." The officer wanted to scream, wanted to grab Treadwell and physically drag him to the ceremony. Instead, he took a breath and spoke with the patience of a man addressing a small child. "The mess sergeant can wait. The Secretary of War cannot. Let's go. Now." They rushed Treadwell from the kitchen to the ceremonial platform. He barely had time to rinse his hands, no time to change uniforms. He arrived wearing work clothes with visible grease stains on the sleeves. His hands were still damp from dishwater. Secretary Woodring looked at the young sergeant standing before him, took in the stained uniform, the wet hands, the complete absence of military bearing that should have accompanied such a solemn occasion. But Woodring had read the mission reports, had seen the photographs, had approved the decoration based on actions that were beyond dispute. Whatever Treadwell looked like now, he had earned this honor on May 1st. Woodring placed the Medal of Honor around Treadwell's neck, the blue ribbon with white stars, the gold medal hanging heavy against his chest. The newsreel cameras captured everything. The photographs went out to newspapers across America. The official story emphasized the heroism, the historic significance, the first enlisted Medal of Honor in Europe, the ceremony that honored American courage and determination. The unofficial story spread through the 8th Air Force within hours. Snuffy Treadwell, the hero who was washing dishes when they found him, the man who couldn't stay out of trouble long enough to attend his own ceremony. The irony was too perfect, too absurd. Veterans would tell the story for decades afterward. Proof that courage and character were not the same thing. Proof that a man could be heroic for 90 minutes and problematic for every other moment of his existence. Treadwell flew 4 more combat missions after receiving the Medal of Honor. Each time he climbed into the ball turret and watched the ground fall away and felt the same fear he had felt on May 1st. The decoration around his neck didn't make the fear disappear. The newspaper articles didn't make German fighters less deadly. The 5th mission broke him. August 23rd. Target aircraft factories outside Munich. The flak was heavy. The fighters aggressive. Treadwell froze. Couldn't function. Couldn't fire his guns. Just sat in the ball turret and shook while the rest of the crew fought off the attack. When they landed, the medical officer took one look at him and knew. Operational exhaustion. The modern term is post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1943, they called it combat fatigue. Shell shock. Nerves. They had a dozen names for the same basic truth. Some men could only absorb so much trauma before their minds refused to process any more. Treadwell was grounded. No more combat flying. The Medal of Honor recipient, who had saved 6 lives over France, would spend the rest of his war behind a desk, processing paperwork, filing reports, surrounded by men who still flew and still fought while he sat in an office trying not to think about fire. The nightmares started immediately. Burning aircraft, the smell of aviation fuel, the sound of ammunition cooking off. He would wake up in his bunk, convinced he could smell smoke, would check his hands expecting to see burns, would lie awake until morning, unable to fall back asleep. The disciplinary problems continued, perhaps worsened. He argued with officers, failed to complete assigned tasks, showed up late for formations. The Medal of Honor bought him some protection. Officers were reluctant to punish a decorated hero, but there were limits to what even a Medal of Honor could excuse. By December of 1944, the Army had run out of patience. A formal board reviewed Treadwell's record, listed the infractions, the insubordination, the failure to maintain military discipline, the pattern of behavior that had existed before May 1st and continued after. On December 18, 1944, Staff Sergeant Harlan Treadwell was reduced in rank to private. The demotion was unprecedented. No Medal of Honor recipient in American military history had ever been stripped of rank while still in service. The contrast was too stark, too embarrassing. The Army did not publicize the action. Newspaper editors who might have run the story decided it would damage morale. Better to let the hero remain heroic in public memory. Treadwell wore the private stripes for the next 2 months, still had the Medal of Honor, still received the respect that decoration commanded. But everyone at Thurley knew the worst airman in the squadron had been a problem before his moment of glory, remained a problem after. Heroism hadn't fixed the fundamental character flaws that made him incompatible with military service. In February of 1945, the Army sent him home. The war in Europe had 4 months left. The 8th Air Force would continue bombing Germany until the final surrender. Thousands of young Americans would die in B-17s over targets Treadwell would never see. He returned to Michigan. Cairo organized a parade. The citizens who remembered Harlan Treadwell as a troublemaker now celebrated him as a returning hero. They lined the streets, waved flags, cheered, welcomed back the local boy who had earned the Medal of Honor. None of them knew about the demotion. None of them knew about the disciplinary record. They knew only what the newspapers had told them. Harlan Treadwell was a hero, an inspiration, a reason to believe that ordinary Americans could become extraordinary when their country needed them. Treadwell stood in the back of an open car and waved to the crowds. For one afternoon, he was everything the Army had wanted him to be: a symbol, an inspiration, a reason to believe. The parade ended. The crowds dispersed. Harlan Treadwell began the long process of figuring out what came next. The war ended in May. Germany surrendered. The bombing campaign that had cost 26,000 American airmen their lives was over. Treadwell's discharge papers arrived 2 weeks later, May 26, 1945. He was 33 years old, a former private with a Medal of Honor. No plan for civilian life, no skills that translated to peacetime employment, no idea what a man like him was supposed to do when the war ended. The transition was brutal. Treadwell had never been good at holding jobs before the war. His personality hadn't improved during military service. He remained argumentative, opinionated, convinced of his own superiority despite all evidence to the contrary. These characteristics had made him unpopular in the Army. They made him equally unemployable in civilian life. He cycled through positions: clerical work, tax preparation, retail. Nothing lasted. The pattern was always the same. Start a job, clash with supervisors, either quit or get fired. The Medal of Honor opened doors. His behavior closed them immediately. Employers who hired a war hero discovered they had also hired a difficult employee, a man who couldn't take direction, who lectured co-workers about how things should be done, who showed up late and made excuses, and seemed genuinely surprised when his employers lost patience. His personal life followed similar trajectories. He married again after the war. The marriage lasted 18 months, then another marriage, 14 months, then a third. Each woman was initially attracted to the heroic story. Each woman eventually discovered the complicated man behind it, the man who couldn't sleep, who smelled smoke that wasn't there. Who told the story of May 1st constantly? Who seemed unable to move beyond those 90 minutes? By the early 1950s, Harlan Treadwell had become exactly what he had been before May 1st, 1943. A man who couldn't quite make life work, who had moments of brilliance surrounded by long stretches of failure, who carried a Medal of Honor in a drawer somewhere while he struggled to pay child support. Again, the same crime that had sent him into the military now following him through civilian life. He was not alone. Thousands of veterans returned from the war with decorations and trauma, and no framework for processing either. The generation that had saved the world came home to discover that heroism didn't pay mortgages. Combat skills didn't translate to civilian employment. The psychological wounds of warfare didn't heal just because the shooting stopped. The Veterans Administration existed to help, but resources were limited. Understanding was incomplete. Post-traumatic stress remained poorly understood. The men who jumped at loud noises, who couldn't sleep without nightmares, who found themselves unable to connect with families who hadn't shared their experiences. These men were expected to simply adjust. Many couldn't. Treadwell coped by talking about the war, constantly. He told the story of May 1st to anyone who would listen. The tale grew more elaborate over the years. Details were added. His role expanded. By the 1970s, Treadwell's version of events had him personally flying the damaged B-17 back to England, a feat that had actually been performed by Captain Calloway throughout the entire ordeal. Veterans who knew the truth said nothing publicly. The code of military brotherhood protected even difficult men from outside criticism. Treadwell was one of them. The Medal of Honor he wore represented something larger than any individual. To attack his credibility was to attack the credibility of every man who had served. But privately they knew. The story had been impressive enough without embellishment. Treadwell couldn't leave it alone, couldn't let the truth be sufficient. Perhaps it was understandable. The 90 minutes over France had been the high point of his entire existence. Everything before had been failure. Everything after would be struggle. That one afternoon stood alone as proof that Harlan Treadwell was capable of greatness. He clung to it because he had nothing else. In 1979, Treadwell gave his final major interview. A military history magazine wanted to publish accounts from Medal of Honor recipients. Treadwell was 67 years old, living alone in a small apartment in Tampa, Florida, surviving on veterans' benefits and a modest pension. The story he told the interviewer was the most elaborate version yet. He claimed to have fought off 30 German fighters single-handedly, claimed to have flown the aircraft when both pilots were wounded, claimed the British had wanted to award him the Victoria Cross, but American regulations prohibited it. None of it was true. Captain Calloway had never been wounded. The number of fighters was documented. The British award was pure fiction. But the interviewer accepted the story without fact-checking. The article was published. Perpetuated the myths Treadwell had been building for 36 years. Other veterans from the 306th Bomb Group read it, shook their heads, said nothing publicly. He was 67. He had the medal. Let him have his story. Harlan Treadwell died on May 11, 1984. St. Petersburg, Florida. Heart failure. He was 72 years old. He had outlived Captain Calloway, had outlived most of the men who had flown with him, and most who had refused to fly with him. The obituary in the local newspaper was brief. Medal of Honor recipient passes away. Services to be held at Arlington National Cemetery. A few paragraphs summarizing a life that had contained 90 minutes of extraordinary courage, surrounded by 7 decades of ordinary struggle. Medal of Honor recipients are entitled to burial at Arlington, regardless of their subsequent service record. The demotion didn't matter. The disciplinary problems didn't matter. Only the medal mattered. Only those 90 minutes on May 1st, 1943. The funeral was small. A handful of veterans from the 306th. Some local Florida servicemen who had never met him but came to honor the decoration. No family. His children were estranged. His ex-wives didn't attend. Graham Pierce, the journalist who had written the original article, sent a wreath but didn't make the trip from New York. The military honors were rendered with precision. Honor guard, flag folding, 3-rifle volley. Taps played over rows of white headstones that stretched to the horizon. Generals buried next to privates. Heroes next to ordinary soldiers. The democracy of death erasing all distinctions. Treadwell's headstone was simple. White marble. Standard government issue. Harlan Treadwell Staff Sergeant, United States Army Air Forces, Medal of Honor, 1912 to 1984. The headstone used his highest rank achieved, Staff Sergeant, not the final rank of private, the Army's small act of grace, allowing the man to be remembered as he was during his finest moment rather than his worst. The question remains, how do we remember Harlan Treadwell? The historical record is clear. At 14:14 on May 1st, 1943, 3 men made the reasonable choice. They bailed out of a burning aircraft. All 3 were captured. All 3 died before sunset. Harlan Treadwell made the unreasonable choice. He stayed in an aircraft with 1,000-degree flames, threw burning ammunition out windows while German fighters attacked, fought fire with destroyed hands for 90 minutes. 6 men went home because of it. Captain Everett Calloway completed his 25th mission, returned to Ohio, lived until 1978. Sergeant Clayton Voss recovered from his wounds, survived the war, lived until 1989. 4 other crew members in the nose section survived because Treadwell kept the fire from burning through the fuselage structure. 6 families got their sons and husbands and fathers back. The Medal of Honor citation doesn't mention Treadwell's personality, doesn't mention that nobody wanted to fly with him, doesn't mention the kitchen police duty or the demotion or the 40 years of embellished stories. It mentions only this: on May 1st, 1943, Staff Sergeant Harlan Treadwell fought fire aboard a crippled bomber for 90 minutes. He threw burning ammunition from the aircraft while under enemy attack. He saved the life of a wounded crew member. His actions were solely responsible for the safe return of the aircraft and the survival of 6 men. That's the official record, verified by witnesses, confirmed by physical evidence, proven by 6 men who lived when they should have died. Harlan Treadwell was difficult at 20, difficult at 31, difficult at 72. He was heroic for 90 minutes on May 1st, 1943. He was problematic for most of the remaining 26,280 days of his life. But when fire filled the sky over France, when 3 men reasonably chose to jump, when every calculation said save yourself, when a wounded man lay trapped in the tail section with no one else to help him, Harlan Treadwell grabbed a blanket and fought. Not because he was brave, not because he was selfless, but because the alternative, living the rest of his life knowing he had abandoned Clayton Voss, seemed worse than burning. That's not perfection. That's not even particularly admirable character. That's just a flawed man making a choice in the worst moment of his life, and getting it right. Maybe that's all heroism ever is, the willingness to act when everyone else reasonably chooses not to. 78. B-17S took off on the morning of May 1st, 1943. 6 men came home in Harlan Treadwell's aircraft. Because the worst airman in the 306th Bomb Group refused to let a wounded man burn alone, the rest is just fire and smoke and 72 years of being human. But those 90 minutes were enough.